This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
I'd like to take from what Professor Good has been talking about some similarities, some looking at experts in the courts, our role, and also some contrasts of how, I'm going to call it psychological evidence, but broadly medical evidence, is treated in the courts. Standing back a second though, what I'm going to talk about is how we feed evidence into the courts, how we help with the decision-making process that happens in the appeal courts. And just to set the scene, we have to go back a step and remember that this is an extraordinarily difficult job. It's not one that I want to have to do myself, I have to say. The context is complex, political, pulls this way and that. These decisions are critical. Everybody knows that they're life or death decisions. Get them right one way, it's a disaster. Get them wrong the other way, it's a disaster. They rely on very little information. Very often it's just a story and some background country information. And so they're drawing on the understanding of the judge that the judge is bringing, and also the expert evidence that can be brought in. And so, as we've heard, one body of expert evidence that comes into the courts is the anthropological evidence. And in this case, there are two forms of evidence. There are the expert reports that Professor Good and others do, which is a specific report relating to this particular case, looking at facts of this case and what may or may not be the story that the person is bringing and how that fits. But there's also the background information, the information about that country, what do we know to be the case in the particular country. And I've pinched the quotation that you've already seen. If this Iron Judge fails to relate the story to the background evidence, he's applying the wrong approach. So what happens with medical legal reports or psychological reports? Well, there's just the individual report, isn't there? There is no sense of the background, what is the context for that individual report about that individual person. And I draw here on a quotation from John Barnes, who is now retired senior immigration judge, who makes this point that with country evidence, there's other material. You can go and look on the net and look at Amnesty International reports and set that report within a context. But with medical evidence, he said, there's no breadth of evidence. So in the next few minutes, what I'd like to do is make a case for there being a breadth of psychological evidence. Professor Good has inspired me to do a bit of amateur cultural anthropology of my own, but again I've drawn on this paper from John Barnes because obviously I know nothing about being a judge and how one gets there and the culture of judging. But John Barnes makes this very neat description of what I'm thinking of as the authority that judges draw upon, and I'm going to contrast it to the authority that I've learned to draw on as a clinician and as a scientist. And there's this sense of hierarchy, the checks and balances of the different levels of courts. There's the experience that the judge brings to the decision-making. There's the input from the other parties, the collecting the expert evidence and other evidence that's important to the decision, and a sense of working together in order to provide a consistency and an understanding of the role. Now that's quite different. I want to give this as background as we move on. That's quite different from where a lot of us come from. As I was trained to be a scientist practitioner, to combine the two. That's where that bit of jargon comes from. But the idea that we're looking to scientific evidence, and by that we mean the predefining of the hypothesis, the testing of the hypothesis, the reviewing of a number of studies which have tested the hypothesis, bringing those together, whether that be with statistical methods into a meta-analysis, or as a review by looking at the body of evidence, the body of research, and bringing together into conclusions based on hypothesis testing produced evidence. And then the peer review system of publishing that evidence so that it goes into a body of literature, but that is checked by other colleagues in the field before it gets So the quality of the evidence is tested that way. So very different cultures that we're coming from. I just want us to bear that in mind as we go through this. So this background has led us to set up the Centre for the Study of Emotional Law. And I want to introduce this just briefly because this is going to run through the seminars, this series of seminars. We are set up to provide independent research to conduct those different types of studies, the primary, the hypothesis testing studies, as well as the secondary reviews of the work that's out there. And the idea of this is to provide information to everybody in the decision-making field, not to advocate for one side or another side, but to provide information into the asylum process. And I'm going to take you through an overview of the sort of information that I think can be provided. So in order to get started, if you like, providing the sort of research that should be useful for the process of decision making, what we set out to do was to first step back and see how are decisions being made? What are the sort of decisions in terms of what I would notice as a psychologist? What are the psychology decisions that are being made within this system? And I drew on some writing by academic or legal academics who, in a sense, I think this gives a background to this idea that although you need individual reports to diagnose perhaps mental health issues in a particular claimant, there's a suggestion here that when it comes to the overall sort of understanding of how people generally are, that's not expert knowledge. And I know there's a whole legal background to this. I know there is one. I don't know it very thoroughly. But there's this sense that when it comes to human nature, that's something which is and can be understood. And this idea from Regina Greycar, who's an Australian legal academic, who talks about looking through the window on the world and making a judgment. But her criticism is that, of course, if you think about the culture and that we all bring to any data that we look at, that we interpret, in fact, it's not always a clear window. It's very often a mirror which is just mirroring back at us what we know already. So, we set out to do a study of the assumptions, as we termed it, that were being made in UK determinations by immigration judges. So we recruited law firms, we collected together some determinations, and we developed a coding structure from which we were able to get a data set of assumptions that were being made. So essentially, within credibility or plausibility statements, I don't believe this could have happened the way he said, because. And what's the because? What's the reasoning for thinking that a certain person may or may not have acted in a certain way? I'm going to run quickly through some of the results from the qualitative analysis that we then did of that data set. So we found that there were three themes to this data. There are assumptions about how people behave here, how asylum seekers behave in the system here in the UK. First, about what people know or what people do with the rules of the procedure. So here's the statement: we did not find it credible that if the appellant had fled in fear of his life, he would have made no effort to seek asylum here. It's an assumption about what the asylum seeker knows and how they might behave in a certain situation. There's assumptions about disclosure. She would have mentioned this earlier. This, of course, is about an allegation of a sexual assault. And so there's an assumption that people are able to disclose sexual violence at the earliest possible opportunity. There are also assumptions about how other people in the system work. So this underlying this is something about the solicitor is able to judge when somebody needs to see a psychiatrist. So that's an assumption about what the role of solicitors is. And I'm going to come to that later. We've done a little bit of a study about that. There's a study about how people behave during traumatic experiences, after traumatic experiences. So this husband sent a wife ahead of the sister. Is that normal family behaviour? And the point about all these is not that It's not that they're true or false assumptions, or they're good or bad assumptions, or that they lead to more positive decisions or more negative decisions. The point is that on many of these points, there is a psychological literature, there is a scientific literature out there which has a view, if you like, on these issues. So are these assumptions in line with that literature, or do they actually contradict that literature? Because if they contradict it, then I think maybe there's a problem. The second one here is what people do when they're in a state of fear. There are a lot of assumptions made about the nature of a true narrative. How can we tell when someone's telling the truth? They don't forget about serious events, such as a rape. A true account has a texture and richness to it. That one is, in fact, in line with a lot of writing on autobiographical memory. Consistencies, very commonly taken as an indication of someone is lying. I'm not going to go over our research this evening that we've done on inconsistencies in memory. We've also reviewed it recently, because I know a lot of people in the audience have heard it many times. You don't want to hear it again. But there is now a fairly consistent story in the literature that people are not consistent if you interview them a number of times. And there are particular reasons for that if you're interviewing them about traumatic experiences. So at the end of this study, we've collected together a set of, if you like, hypotheses about the world and about human beings and how they behave. And so those hypotheses are all subject to testing. And so our proposal is that these are either the basis of study to test which way they fall. How do people behave after they've been raped in certain cultures? How do people behave in a state of fear? And in some cases there'll be a literature already out there, and in some cases there won't. So there's primary studies and secondary studies to be done. We've also we've also turned our attentions to immigration lawyers, as well as decision makers. And this is very briefly another qualitative study asking immigration lawyers when do they consider commissioning a medico-legal report, specifically a psychological medico-legal report. And the findings from this qualitative interview study suggested that the group of people that we were able to talk to were very knowledgeable about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, very knowledgeable about the effects of traumatic experiences on their clients. And so they were pretty good at spotting, if you like, the typical anxious, scared presentation of somebody who'd been traumatised by their experiences. They were less good at recognising or thinking about the people who weren't showing obvious emotions. They were perhaps a little bit flattened, which the clinicians amongst you will know is also a way of presenting as traumatised after dreadful experiences. And so there's a suggestion there that some people are being missed. They didn't see that depression was a reason to inquire more about someone's mental health, even though the symptoms of depression include all sorts of things that would affect their ability to give evidence, such as lack of concentration, feelings of worthlessness and of guilt, which can profoundly affect the way in which you answer and which you conduct yourselves. There were assumptions about the categories, I'm going to call the categories of things that happen to people. So, well, she was raped, so she better go and see a psychologist because she must be having problems. And that's fine as far as it goes, but the lawyers amongst you will notice that there's a circularity in that argument, which we also see in, for example, screening of detention, where the idea is that if somebody has been tortured, therefore they're vulnerable and they should be taken out, but they only allege that they were tortured. If we don't believe they're tortured, then they're not vulnerable, and it's not working, is it? So there's a problem there. And also we saw that people were being driven by their own comfort levels. So when somebody is terribly distressed and all over the place and no boundaries, then the lawyer is more likely to say, oh, I think they need to get some help here. Where they're very contained and quiet and not presenting that problem, in a sense, and they're less likely to get referred. And we see that also in just in general health service literature. So, what's the answer? We've, as I say, I'm not going to go into any specific primary quantitative studies that we've done on some of these matters today, but what I'd like to do is just take you through the process from beginning to end, in a sense, so a selection of the beginning to end, and just suggest that there are areas across all of these where psychological literature and knowledge has something to contribute to help in this extraordinarily difficult area. So starting from the beginning, someone's coming in, seek asylum, they need protection, they've got to start talking, they've got to start explaining what the problem is and why they want protection. And that's a matter of trust. For some people it's a big problem, some people it's a small problem, but being able to establish that level of trust to be able to disclose one's experiences is something that psychologists deal with all the time, and particularly people who deal with trauma and traumatic experiences. So when it comes to people who have very difficult material to disclose, that information about establishing trust is something that psychology has to contribute. Then, the way of establishing fear of future harm is to establish that one remembers things that's happened that give one a reason to believe it's going to happen again. That's autobiographical memory. That's remembering personal episodes from one's own past. And yet, in this, well, I've expanded this slightly because this is a paper we've just done reviewing memory, different forms of memory, different aspects of memory, relating them to the asylum process. And it turns out that why do we have autobiographical memory? Why do we remember episodes? Why do we remember episodes from our past? Why do we evolve to be able to do this thing? Well, it helps with social bonding, relating to each other. It's a guide to how we feel about things. If you kick me today, okay, but if I remember that you kicked me last week and the week before and the week before, I'm going to feel differently about that. And future behaviour, I might kick you back if I remember all those other episodes. It's about identity and expression of self. It's about, if I can remember how I performed giving a speech this evening, then that's going to help me think about who I am and how I tell other people the story of that. It's pretty much clear now that memory is not a matter of going to a filing cabinet and picking out a fact. It is each time a reconstruction of what we're now needing to say, for all these reasons, about the past. So in the same way that Anthony was saying, that these are not facts, these are reconstructions of our own memories with all our different motivations for picking those particular memories and expressing them in those particular ways. And turns out they're very, very affected by culture. Different types of culture actually teach their little ones to remember in different ways. There's a body of research looking at collectivist cultures as opposed to individualistic cultures, and, it's not surprisingly, they get to be different because they use memory in different ways. So if you ask someone from individualistic culture to give a story, like we do in the asylum process, what happened to you, where were you, what did you do, what did they do? Someone from an individualistic culture gives that kind of story. You ask for someone from a more collective, communal culture, they're much more likely to give you a story of what happened to the group and what happens generally to this. This is the way we do things. I'm simplifying that horribly, but just suffice to say there's a big difference. And that, of course, is relevant. Traumatic memory, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but suffice to say there's quite a lot to say about it. There are very different things that happen when a life-threatening experience, a horrific experience happens to us. We remember it in quite a different way, which is what gives rise to the very different types of memory that we have about those moments. And traumatic or not, disclosing material which is difficult, which feels, for whatever reason, shameful, which one doesn't want to address, perhaps because it's very painful. Again, that's an area where there is research. There's lots of general research out there. There's research from therapeutic settings about people disclosing things in therapy. There are also studies now that we've done, there's a study that we've done looking at that specifically in the asylum process. Thank you. Moving on, there are other areas in the interviewing, so I'm going to go quickly over this because we're here to talk about decision making. But within interviewing, suggestibility is a big area that's been researched. Gudjonsson is one of the big names in this area, looking at the idea of leading questions and what are the things that can make people more likely. Some people are more suggestible than others, but you can raise that suggestibility by making them anxious, by raising the stakes on how important it is for them to get it right. The sort of things we do in asylum interviews. And facilitating disclosure again, that's the application of the research on disclosure issues. In decision making, that takes you into the area of psycholegal research. And interestingly, this is coming from the psycholegal research. But where's the psycholegal research in the refugee law? It's all to do with criminal law and other areas of law, and there's tons of it, and there are whole departments in America looking at emotion and law, but not in this area. That's it, I'll leave that hanging. And finally, the final thing, well not final, but the final thing in my particular list, I think that we don't spend any time on, is what I call the emotional burden. So the effect on people, on us, all of us, of hearing continual, unrelenting stories of trauma and horror, and yes, lies, and having to decide which are the real ones and which are the false ones. And the effects of, not just the effects on us in the terms of looking after ourselves, because that's nice and soft and fluffy, but what effect does that have on our decision making? How easy is it to make a really good rational decision when one is trying to deal with the emotional burden of hearing it and doing that work? So I hope I've given enough of an overview to suggest that perhaps there is a breadth of evidence in which to understand the specific questions about the mental health status of specific individuals. There is a sense in which that sits on a bedrock of broader information and knowledge and research about how people are, how they present, how they remember things, how they suffer from trauma, etc. And over the course of these coming seminars, you're going to be hearing from other psychologists taking different angles on this area, but bringing in information that can underpin and inform and add to the work that lawyers and decision makers and policy makers are doing in this field. And that's just my little call to say, collaborate, talk. So we're doing it. I think on the researcher side, we need to be disseminating what knowledge there already is, because there's already plenty. It's not as if we have to go off and start doing original studies. There's plenty of stuff. And it has to be disseminated in a form that's relevant and makes sense and is translated, is the jargon. Also, there are some specific questions, and I'm always interested to hear from people, what are the questions, what are the things where you think, so going back to those assumptions, taking the criticism out of those, where are the things where you think, yes, I do always make that assumption, but that's the one I'm really not happy about, I don't know why I think like that. Is there any research on that? And if not, can you go and research it? And that's the collaboration. I think an acknowledgement of this knowledge and commissioning the research and consulting the research and thinking about drawing it in as a breadth of knowledge. And finally, please look at our website for all the references that I've made vague reference to, but not actually said anything about. All the papers are on there. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.